So welcome. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Huckleberry Youth Program's Juvenile Justice Reform Panel. I'm Doug Stiles. I'm the Executive Director of Huckleberry Youth Programs and will be facilitating the conversation this evening. For over 2 decades, Huckleberry's Community Assessment and Resource Center has been a leader in juvenile justice reform in San Francisco and a model across the country, diverting more than 8,000 arrested youth from further involvement with justice systems. We'll talk more about how CARC and other community-based organizations have significantly reduced juvenile detention bookings, resulting in the historic upcoming closure of San Francisco Juvenile. A large portion of support for Huckleberry comes through community partners like you. So please consider joining the Huckleberry family by making a 100% tax-deductible donation so that we may continue to provide mental health services and case management to arrested youth and their families. You can give by visiting huckleberryouth.org or by texting HYP to 71660. Tonight's discussion has been sponsored by the following generous corporations and individuals who have contributed $5,000 or more to our spring 2021 events. The Carolyn and Peter Friedman Foundation, Diane Tressenfeld and Ed Waldrop, First Republic Bank, Sutter Health, the Golden State Warriors, Union Bank, Derry Stasel, and Gary Gottlieb in honor of Shelley Gottlieb. So now I'm very pleased to introduce our panelists for tonight. Huckleberry's Director of Youth Justice, Denise Coleman. Denise has led Huckleberry's CARC program for 22 years. Denise also serves on the board of directors at the National Assessment Center Association and is a key member of the closed juvenile hall working group in San Francisco. Welcome, Denise Coleman.
Thank you, Doug.
Sheryl Evans Davis is the executive director of the San Francisco Youth Commission. Sheryl helped launch San Francisco's Office of Racial Equity and led the process to allocate law enforcement dollars to the Black community. Sheryl also leads community engagement for the Alternatives to Policing Steering Committee, and she oversees the closed juvenile hall working group. Mayor London Breed appointed Sheryl as the chair of the mayor's Blue Ribbon Panel on Juvenile Justice Reform. Welcome, Sheryl Evans Davis. And finally, Allison Mcgee, who is the executive director of the Zellerbach Foundation. Allison's previous work as deputy director for the San Francisco Juvenile Probation Department, including developing a national model for juvenile justice reform. She's also a member of the Mayor's Blue Ribbon Task Force for Juvenile Justice Reform and established a collaborative model for the city's funding of community-based services that resulted in over $14 million in dedicated funding for violence prevention programs for San Francisco youth. Welcome, Allison Mcgee. So let's get to it. To start us off, I'd like to look a little bit at who's currently in the hall, in our juvenile hall in San Francisco. The number of incarcerated youth for the past couple decades we know has been decreasing. For example, in the 1990s, we had almost on average 200 youth in lockup. 10 years ago, we had about 100 youth in lockup. And today, there are 9, just 9 youth in lockup. 3 Black females, 1 Asian Pacific Islander female, 5 Black males, and only 1 white male. So though the number of incarcerated youth has come down over the years and dramatically during the pandemic, the overrepresentation of Black and Latinx young people has grown. It's worse now than it was at the beginning of the pandemic. Nationally, Black youth make up only 14% of minors, but according to Annie E. Casey Foundation, they make up 35% of females and 42% of male minors who are in lockup. And they're more likely to remain longer in lockup. So I'm going to turn the first question to you, Allison. What's been going on in the past and how did we get here?
Well, first, thank you so much for including me in the conversation. I'm so honored to be here and with you all. I have the greatest respect and admiration for each of you. And so thank you and just really glad to be here and have this conversation. You know, regarding the numbers, I think there's not a simple answer. There's not a single answer. There are many different factors that have contributed to sort of the place that we're in today. We know that nationally, statewide, juvenile rates of crime have gone down consistently, as they have for adults. That is due to a whole bunch of factors, but it's pretty consistent. San Francisco is unique, though, because the changes in our numbers have been especially dramatic. And I think a lot of that is to do with San Francisco and the community in San Francisco, community providers like Huckleberry. Remember, San Francisco is the only still county in the state that has a unique juvenile probation department. It's the only county in the state that has a civilian commission that oversees that probation department. Its juvenile hall bookings have declined every year since 2006, just about every year since 2006. We have some of the lowest rate of state confinement for our youth. We have some of the lowest rates of direct files for our youth. So we've really come a long way, and the reforms that have been put into place are really a result of a very strong community of advocates and providers like Huckleberry. And I can't emphasize that enough, because I think that when we look at reform efforts, we know that systems don't reform themselves, right? We know that departments and public systems don't reform themselves for all kinds of reasons. And it really does take the insight, partnership, advocacy of so many others, providers, families, young people, advocates, to do that work. And really, that's what we've seen over the last many, many decades. The other thing on that is that you all have been in this for a long time, right? I was joking with Denise that we've known each other now for 15 years, and I am still the new girl. You all have deep, deep, long relationships that have really created this very tight-knit group across the city, across sectors, of people who are really partners in this work and can have those difficult conversations and can celebrate the wins together. So I think that's really important. And then just lastly, on the disparities, despite these wins, San Francisco's disparities are actually worse than in many other counties. And we continue to see that. In 2020, almost 70% of the young people that were detained in juvenile hall were Black. 97% were kids of color. And I believe San Francisco's percentage of Black young people in the city overall is about 4%, right? So that's pretty stark. And the last thing I'll say on it is that it's been this way for so long, and it continues to get worse incrementally, that it's almost like the city has been sort of just complacent about it. We've just accepted that this is the way it is. You don't hear a lot of outrage about it anymore. You don't hear people asking the questions, and that's a real problem. So I think this conversation is important, and I think that the work that's happening in the city is also important to sort of remind folks what's really at stake here.
We're in this strange position where we've made so much progress and there's so far to go. I mean, that's kind of what you're saying. So we're now in this place where there's a lot of discussion about closing the hall, and there's a lot of questions about what does that mean, and what's coming next. So I think we'll spend a lot of our time discussing what's been that process, and what does it mean, and what are some of the ideas coming up next. So I'll just throw this out to anybody. Would they like to talk about, so why is the hall closing? What's all of the discussion about why do we need to close a juvenile hall? Isn't that a needed thing in our community?
I feel like I should wait for Denise to weigh in, but I will say, one of the things first, just to echo Allison, really grateful to be here in this space right now and to have the ability to really have this conversation. And so thank you, Doug and Denise and folks for the invitation. I think that there are a lot of things, right? Like for the folks like Denise and others who've been in this work for a really long time. And I feel bad now saying really, because it makes it seem longer than, sorry, but who've been doing this work, is that it was the perfect storm, as they say, right? Like the timing was right. The right people were in position and in elected office to kind of move this forward. People with lived experience, people with the gumption, and then the folks that have been pushing this, that were coming from, not just from this is the right thing to do, or an advocate or an activist mode. It was people who were like, I've been in there, I've experienced it, and I don't know that that helped me do things better. These are the things that helped me kind of with restorative justice. And so I think in some ways, like, we're here now because of the folks who've been doing the work and leading the work. We're here now because of the people who experienced juvenile hall and came out and said, you know what, there's a better way to do this. And because there are also those folks who are in leadership positions right now that said, no, you're right. Like, this change, I shouldn't be the exception to what happens after experience or interaction with the criminal justice system. So in that kind of on the periphery, for me, piece of it, it is all the right people at the right time with, I think, the right motives. And so not to say that folks didn't have it other times, but the alignment and the synergy, I think, for, this moment in time is important. But, I would say Allison and Denise, having really been embedded in it, have more of an insight around why now. But I just see, from me, it really was just everything aligned at this point in time.
I think we
Denise.
also,
Yeah.
Go ahead, Doug.
Well, I was going to ask, you want to talk a little bit about youth development, because I think that that's a critical component to this as well, but you may have another point you were going to make.
No, that's exactly what I was going to speak to, is that, when detention centers were originally created, they were created out of the mindset that our kids were adults, and that they knew the difference, and that there was a conscious thought and effort put forth in getting into the trouble that they were. But now we find out years later that that's not the case. Our kids are being kids. They're getting into trouble. They're making mistakes. Some of them more serious than others. But with any child that makes a mistake, yes, they need to be held accountable, but they also need to be wrapped in the kinds of services that are sufficient for whatever the misbehavior may have been, not locked up in jail as though they are hardened kinds of life producing criminals, because that is not who most of our children are. And so we really have to start thinking differently about how we treat our young people, and to know that even young people that get in trouble, they also deserve the love, the time, the respect, the energy, the effort that we put into our young people that don't get into this particular kind of trouble.
And one of the things we often talk about at Huckleberry are youth are engaging in adolescent risk behavior that's fairly normal for their age. We have many people who are getting arrested for things that many people do, that I've done, that but they happen to be in certain neighborhoods, or their skin color is a certain way, or they're at a certain school, and because of that, they're getting picked up and arrested. And risky behavior is a normal part of adolescence. We don't want anybody to harm themselves or harm others, but it's a part of development, and helping people kind of learn that development makes a lot of sense to me. So let's talk a little bit then about this process of closing juvenile hall. There's the Mayor's Blue Ribbon Task Force, which we've talked a little bit about. There's the Closed Juvenile Hall Working Group. I'm not sure if everybody knows what those are and what the process is and what they're doing. Can somebody talk a little bit about the different elements that are moving this forward right now in San Francisco?
Well, I guess I will start that. So there are these two parallel, like paths or processes that are happening. And so they're finally coming to the point where they're kind of intersecting and coming together. The Blue Ribbon Panel, Mayor Breed announced and launched that as a way to really think about, to your point where you were just talking about, and Denise was talking about youth development, right? When we think about the criminal justice or the juvenile justice system, people really go straight to juvenile hall or to juvenile probation. And really, if we're going to address the challenges and the issues around young people and risky behavior and how they're supported through that process, it's not waiting till they get incarcerated or they get arrested. And so the Blue Ribbon Panel on Juvenile Justice Reform was really meant to say, what's the continuum look like? What are we doing on the front end of this? What are we doing at the hall or whatever place that becomes where young people might be referred? And what are we doing on the back end? What are we doing for families? And so a lot of what we've heard in that space, and that we're hearing also with Closed Juvenile Hall Working Group, is what is the comprehensive support that we provide for young people? And it shouldn't matter, to your point earlier, what they look like, what their zip code is, what school they go to. You know, I've said to folks, like, I taught in private school for a long time, and behavior that was accepted and normalized and kind of talked about as youth development, when I saw it in my own community, was immediately like, you know, call the school resource officer, or did you report that, or you're going to spend your whole life in jail. Like, that's the thing people say to 3-year-olds, right? Or to fifth graders, that when they steal a candy bar, oh my gosh, you're going to be locked up for the rest of your life. When we know that that kind of seeing if you can get away with something is normal, right? Like testing boundaries and how that looks. So the Blue Ribbon Panel was really around that, whereas Closed Juvenile Hall was exactly what you all have said. It's, this isn't working, this facility, this structure, this makeup, and it is overrepresented of people of color, right? And that there is something to be said about the fact that we see certain zip codes or certain genders or certain colors of folks represented in the hall. And so what are we going to do to like blow that system up and start over again? And so that really was the intent. They blend in some spaces and ways in terms of the intentionality, but I think both of them end up going, we've got to have a broader view if we're going to actually support young people to be thriving, whether they live in Pack Heights or whether they live on Treasure Island or in the Tenderloin. Like, that's what we're trying to get to, is how do we make sure that your zip code doesn't determine your likeliness to be arrested?
Also, just to acknowledge Sheryl, who has single-handedly like had to manage both of these parallel processes with not just, you know, the agendas and the logistics and the membership, but the politics and the, like, it's just, I am sure that there has been so much more than we can even tell in that work. And the fact that we've gotten this far and that they're starting to converge and we're starting to get some clarity and structure and what this is going to be is pretty remarkable. And so thank you for all that you've shouldered a lot.
Well, I thank you all for dealing with my ups and downs and personality mood swings. So it's all good.
No, that's okay, because I tell people all the time, when I grow up, I want to be just like Sheryl Davis.
Me too.
Nice. So what are some of the options that people are talking about in the committees in the Closed Juvenile Hall? Because clearly we have, the big question always is safety issues, but maybe we want to leave that a little bit later, because what we're currently talking about are, so what if somebody's not a safety risk to themselves or others and may need some support or may need some connection to school, they may need something else. So what are people talking about in terms of how do we make that happen so that we can get people the services that they need?
There are a couple of recommendations that are out and about right now. We had, as part of the Closed Juvenile Hall Working Group, a couple of our colleagues did some incredible work with some listening sessions with our young people that had been in the hall, young people that were in the system, young people that just were in the community and saw various things in the neighborhood. And the parents who were supporting their young people and trying to love their young people and trying to deal with a system that can a lot of times be incredibly complicated. As well as listening sessions with other community-based providers. And they came out with some incredibly rich and valuable information on what our young people and our families are looking for. Part of which is that they are feeling like they're not being heard, that the services that are being provided based on what the organization or juvenile probation or somebody else thinks is best for them, that we're not opening up our ears and closing our mouths and listening to what our young people are saying. So in addition to being a part of the Closed Juvenile Hall Working Group, I'm also a part of the Juvenile Justice Providers Association, which is a consortium of various providers in San Francisco. And we have developed a blueprint of services for youth that takes the process from the initial point of contact with San Francisco Police to detention alternatives, and placement. And so our recommendation for the front end of the system is that CARC increases and expands its services to a 24-hour central intake for all youth diverted pre and post arrest. Our community care team will engage youth, hear their voice and that of their families, and determine what type of services the youth needs and create an ongoing strategy to ensure that those needs are met. We are in a very different time right now, and the needs and the struggles and the challenges of our young people are very unique to them and individualized. And we have just got to cater and create services and teams that are very specific to fulfilling those needs and desires and dreams and hopes, you know, and goals, and all of that, because even though they're have come in contact with SFPD, it doesn't mean that they don't want something different for themselves, that they have goals and they have dreams, and their families also have goals and dreams for them. And so it's going to be imperative for us to hear them out and know what those dreams and goals and desires are.
And along those lines, why should we include community-based organizations in this process? I mean, why not just develop a whole new system that's, probation? I don't want to say this, clearly not the same system, but why not just create something that's all in one? We do it all in one place. Denise, you could talk a little bit to that, but why we've got a lot of CBOs that are doing a lot of work with youth in San Francisco, and many of them are on this call. Sunset Youth Services, CJCJ. We partner with IFR and CYC. I mean, there's a lot of people doing a lot of great work out there. Why include CBOs is kind of the big question.
Well, I'll give you part of my answer, but I'd also like for you to chime in on this one, Sheryl, because our kids come from the community. Our community-based providers are in the community. Some organizations see kids every day, just based on the fact that they are in the community. They are making connections and building relationships with these young people that a lot of times the system doesn't have, or a juvenile probation officer doesn't have. And so it's important that our young people are connected with the community-based providers, people that live where they live, that are experiencing some of the same challenges and issues that they are experiencing, that have kids that go to the same schools that they go to. And so making that distinction and that connection, I think it's really going to be crucial for the ongoing ability for our young people to thrive in this city, because so many of our kids and families have already been driven out. The few that are here, we need to develop as many strategies and services for them as we possibly can.
Yeah, and I would just echo that, and then, kind of add on to that. It's interesting because, Denise, you started this conversation when you first were talking about how the idea and notion of youth development, or at least the awareness of what youth development is, has changed. And I know there was a question also about, like, how is the Blue Ribbon Panel different from something that happened in the mid-90s? And I would just argue that what's changed is also the value of community voice, right? And that's why community-based organizations are so critical to this, because we typically, speaking from someone who's been in community, ran a community-based organization, but now in government, there tends to be we know what's best, or we read about, evidence-based practices, or we know X, Y, and Z, but we typically have taken community voice and kind of said we did our due diligence and then put that on a shelf. And maybe that didn't happen in the past, but as somebody who came from working in community, as other folks like you all may know from young people and families that you've worked with, they'll say, well, somebody asked me a question, they didn't do anything with what I said. Right. And I think we have the opportunity now to be even more informed, to not just take somebody's opinion about what should happen and then use that to define it and make it what we want. What happens with the different CBOs, community-based organizations, as Denise said, is that it's kind of like, you know, the cereal aisle in the grocery store, right? I couldn't believe that, you know, some folks were upset that grape nuts weren't available, because I'm definitely looking for Captain Crunch or something, right? So we have to have the variety of like the different palettes, the different tastes, the different, really what resonates with people, right? And that we understand that as you get older, you also maybe have a different taste, because now I love oatmeal, but when I was little, I didn't. So I just think that that is why we have to be able to have the community-based organizations, that we have it so that folks are, it's geographic based, or it's based on whether I want to do art or whether I want to do science. I just think that there isn't one size fits all is pretty much where we went wrong in the first place, thinking that we could have it all housed in one place. And it's just not, it's not going to meet the needs of folks. And especially if we're talking about what it looks like to not be punitive, but to also be very focused on youth development. That's a very different strategy and approach.
I just want to add, I mean, this is something that I've been thinking a lot about, and we've been talking a lot about this at the foundation as well. It's, you know, this idea of our government institution being this separate entity from the community is ridiculous. Right. Our public institutions and public systems should be of, for, by the community, right? So our public systems have a responsibility to ensure that our communities have the resources they need to thrive, right? Young people, families, everything. And so this idea of this sort of these separate entities, to me, is crazy. Now, that is the reality to some extent right now. I don't think that's the way it has to be. And I think that there is great opportunity, especially in San Francisco, but more importantly, there's a responsibility in San Francisco and other places for our public institutions to reflect the values and the individuals and families of the communities that we are part of, right? And so ideally, someday, as we get closer, Sheryl, and these conversations, we can get away from this idea of the, you know, us in the public institutions making decisions on behalf of, right? That is not an effective way to go, and we see that. So I just think shifting our center of gravity a little bit to understand the role and the responsibility of the public sector to actually support and be a part of the community.
And along those same lines, if I can quickly, Doug, it's just to say that we, as community-based organizations, we also have to recognize that we are not the end all and be all, right? That sometimes, you know, we think that our kids have failed, but I think, or been unsuccessful, I think that as programs, we are failing because we're not doing what we need to do to make sure that that young person is getting the right kinds of individual and unique attention that they deserve. So as the community, we have to take a good hard look at ourselves as well.
Yeah, kids don't fail, we fail kids.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think that's why it's so important that we're looking at the broader system, and that's why I think this conversation is so interesting. If people have questions, you can put them in the Q&A, and we will, we have some time at the end that we'll definitely look at questions that come up. But if we see them coming and it fits in the conversation, we may just slide those in. We'll see. But speaking of community, so how can people that aren't CBOs, that have questions or have ideas or have some creative solutions, how can they be involved in the process going forward in creating what comes next?
So I can definitely share the link for people to email, and they can email us those things directly, but the meetings are available. I can share, if they email, we can share the website where they can go on and participate and engage in those. And I think that to Allison's point, what we've got to figure out is how we do a better job of helping people that are most impacted actually understand all the things that are happening, because typically they don't find out about it till it's all established and rolled out, and then they're like subjected to the decisions that, you know, the folks who have the time and the wherewithal or the ability to come to meetings and the government institutions or the public institutions organize and coordinate. So I think that that's the piece that we've got to really figure out. How do we get to the folks who are maybe going to be impacted by the decisions we made, but they don't know anything about the meetings that are happening, right? And that's where we need help, right? Like, so I can share, I'll put in the chat my the email to ask about participating or engaging in that process. We're willing to do that. I know that Denise and Allison are also willing to like engage with folks who have questions and point them in the right direction of resources. But I will share, at least on that part, that information for folks who may want to reach out.
Thank you. I think that's very helpful. So security, this is the big, or safety, you know, whatever you want to call it, this is the big question that keeps coming up. What about somebody who's dangerous to themselves or to others? We can't just close the hall and let everybody run free. These are the kinds of things that we're hearing. How do we make sure that my community is safe? If there's somebody who's dangerous that's out on the streets because you're not, you know, putting them away, what do I do? So what are some of the creative solutions that have been talked about? I know that we don't have a full plan yet, it's still in development, but what is being talked about to deal with the safety issue?
Well, some of the conversations have been around a staff secured facility, someplace that's smaller than Juvenile Hall, which is what, 150 bed facility. Look, we've got 9 kids right now in Juvenile Hall that they have deemed needs to be detained. And so if we look at the number 10 as a guideline for the number of kids that could potentially be having to go to a secured place, it would be staff secured. It would not be as big as what we currently have. It will be open. It will be very rehabilitative, very community participatory, and where they can go to school, they can get fresh air. I mean, all the things that a young person needs while they are in detention. But it is our objective, and that of all of us that are working on the closed juvenile hall working group, to minimize that as much as possible, to really do what we need to do to make sure that our young people are not in jail. And of course, there will be some young people who are a danger to the community, who are a danger to themselves, and will have to be confined. And we will have the appropriate place for them that is not jail.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And there's been a lot of conversation around it. And it is a really important, obviously, part of this conversation, but it's not, you know, I think in the past we have built these giant apparatus, tens of millions of dollars a year, based on the very, very small percentage of young people that pose a risk themselves or to others. And the reality is that that's not the case for the vast majority of kids that go through the system. And so how do we create a system that's responds to the needs of all young people and not just assumes the worst of all young people?
And I would just add to that, as a part of this build out and process, what we need to figure out is the education in community. Like I've shared with folks, a lot of times people who've been through the system are much more conservative in their thoughts and their views about punishment and crime. And like, what is it that we're doing to help really engage with community around that, to have a better understanding of that? Because I do think sometimes people think that we're just going to allow all sorts of manner of things to happen without any accountability. And that's not what this conversation is about. And so this is about, like, you took a pack of gum. Like, you don't need to spend 6 months incarcerated because you took a pack of gum, or because, like, I think those are the things that we need to drill down. This isn't about like gun violence and other pieces, and how do we address some of those pieces, because people want to hang their hat on that. And if they don't look at the data and understand who actually has been detained, it's easy to make a false narrative around what's happening, what's not happening, and why people fight against this change. And I think that there's a level of that we also have to accompany with this, so that the narrative doesn't become that's not true to what's actually happening.
And to make sure that whatever we do is developmentally appropriate for our young people, not only age, gender, sexual orientation. We have to keep in mind that it's just not male and female. It's just not age 14 through 17. We've got a wide range of young people that we are dealing with, and we need to make sure that services are appropriate, even detention, not detention, but a secured facility is as appropriate for the variety of young people that we have as the community is.
Thank you. So some people joined us late, so I'm just going to remind everybody of our esteemed panel that we have here. We have Denise Coleman, who's Huckleberry's Director of Youth Justice, Sheryl Evans-Davis, the Executive Director of the San Francisco Youth Commission, and Allison Mcgee, who's the Executive Director of the Zellerbach Foundation. We have a lot of questions coming in, so I'm going to shift our conversation over to answer some of these questions. The first question is, we were talking about, so what are these other programs going to look like? And of course, there's some regulations around evidence-based practices. But as we know, evidence-based practices aren't always fitting for certain communities, and are not as nuanced as may be needed. So how do we look at juggling the evidence-based practice mandates versus what's really needed in different communities? I'll leave that to anybody.
I will say, this is something, recently Mayor Breed and President Walton allocated funds to support the Black community. And one of the things that we've really been trying to work with community on that folks want to see is a community research institute, right? So one of the things that we know is that academia kind of decides what are the best evidence-based practices, and they then decide actually what to study. And what happens is a lot of the work that's happening in community hasn't been studied, right? And I've been talking to different academic institutions, and they've been saying to me, what we need to do is really work with community to flip it from evidence-based practices to practice-based evidence. That we go in, that we look at what the community is already doing, and then say it, and prove that it works, or at least validate that it works. And so that's the other piece of this. So working it backwards, instead of waiting for somebody to do a study to say, let's try these 5 things, because they've also talked about like clinical trials and all of these other things. The access to them are limiting for the folks that actually don't have the money to pay for somebody to come in and do clinical trials and compare what I'm doing, what's happening with the control group and not. So part of this is we have to work it backwards. We have to support the people who know that it works because they've done it, but nobody studied their work. And so that's where in this next phase of this work, working with people like Allison and with Fred Blackwell and folks at the San Francisco Foundation to invest and to be able to prove what you all know from the decades of doing this work, what you all know from tracking it, and that you have that. But the folks like Malik Wade and other folks who are doing this work may not have it documented in the same way. It doesn't mean that their work is any less valuable. So that's where we've got to have the shift. Because everybody talks about evidence-based practices, but we don't know that if we're really honest about it, evidence-based practices are biased and discriminatory in the way that they choose who gets studied and what gets valued.
The other thing is, James, the amazing, wonderful James Bell talks about radical imagination, right? And I think that we need to free ourselves of these sort of constraints around evidence-based, whatever it is, and really think creatively around what's happening in the community now. What do folks want? What do they need? And what can we do to respond? I mean, CARC, when it started, was the first program of its kind in the country. It was not evidence-based at that point, right? It took time to validate the work of CARC, but it was not evidence-based itself when it started. There are many other programs that we fund and that are out there that aren't necessarily evidence-based, but they are wildly creative, wildly imaginative, and they wrap young people with love, right? And so I think we need to be careful when we talk about or we require ourselves to fit within a box like evidence base, not really understanding, like Sheryl says, what that means, who's been left out of those trials, and so on. So I think this idea of radical imagination is a really important one, especially in San Francisco. We have a single police department, a single school district, right? We're a city and a county. We can really, there's so much we can do that others can't do. And I hope that this process takes us closer to that.
Thank you. Before we go on to another question, I misspoke. Sheryl is the executive director of the Human Rights Commission. So I apologize for that, Sheryl. You do so many things. There's just this list of stuff that just pops up. So one question came in. Older youth are now being seen. Some of the Tay youth who are over 18 but under 25. Are we talking about them, and what is the future going to look like for them? Are they going to be in the same facilities? Are they going to be in the same programs? What does that look like?
Well, I will take this just from a logistical viewpoint and working with President Walton and with the Board of Supervisors on the closed juvenile hall working group. Like we are bound by what was in place previously, which is not looking up to age 24. And, you know, Denise, I don't know if that's come up at JJPA, like what that looks like in terms of the pivot and the concerns. And I think that, you know, again, when we know developmentally that folks are still growing and that their brain is still developing in that older age, but what does it look like to actually put people in the facility together? I think that is another concern that folks have. And so closed juvenile hall working group is focused on up to 18 or a little bit more, and then not up to the age 24, and that the juvenile justice reform was looking at the continuum. So it's looking at households and all of that, but again, not about shared facility. But I'd be interested to hear what thoughts JJPA and even Allison, what you all are thinking in regards to these kind of shifts and movements.
Denise, you want to take it?
Go ahead. No.
I mean, it's a hot, literally, we're like, who's taking it?
I know, right?
It's I feel like I just feel like we don't know. I mean, so many things are, especially in California, with 823 and all these things that are sort of happening in real time, and there are still changes being made, and people still sort of figuring out it's really difficult to kind of put a stake in the ground and say, this is how we feel, this is where we are, just because we're learning every day. So it's a tricky one to answer. I think that we have to be really thoughtful. I think we have to be really, we have to listen and, you know, make those decisions in community. It's a tough one to really respond to right now.
You know, I do think that we've got to bring the TAYA to the table and find out what their needs are. And because some of us have been really zeroed in on the adolescents. And this is a very different age group, different in the fact that they are considered adults, but the development of their brain is not fully recognized either. So, you know, trying to find that sweet spot that's going to work for this population is going to be very, very important, because they are right now maintaining a very large part of the population in San Francisco. And so we are really going to have to be incredibly conscientious and dutiful and responsible as we figure out services for this population.
So another question that's come in is, where do we see the schools, and what involvement do we see educators or school counselors or the district being involved in the future process as well?
Schools are key. You know, schools, kids are, well, they used to be in the classroom a third of their lives. You know, now
They
they're
will
outside.
again. They will again. It'll happen
Okay.
again.
Okay. And I remember growing up how they used to talk about that educators were one of the top 3 primary influencers in your life. You know, and so I think school plays a very important role in not only providing the space for our young people to grow, develop, and learn, but also in including community-based organizations so that when they need an extra hand or some extra support with some of the young people, that they invite us to the table and they allow us to be a part of whatever that plan is to help this young person be more advantageous to themselves and to the community and to their families. So the schools, they play a huge role in stuff, and I would love to see them really embrace the community more to be a part of their process.
I mean, I would add to that and say that when we're talking about the holistic approach, right? Like there is something, you know, like there are all these things that talk about school to prison pipeline. Like we really, really have to be much more intentional and understand the trauma that people bring to schools as parents, right? Like the trepidation and the anxiety and all of that they bring into that space, which then impacts how they interact or engage on behalf of their children. And so I, you know, as someone who spent, oh gosh, I don't even know how many, like 20 years maybe as a teacher, right? Like I know that, you know, I just remember like the things that students came into the classroom and said, like you have a window into so much, and like how you take that information and how you use that to support, or how you use it to even shift how you teach a lesson or which lessons you teach are really important. And I think that schools are critical to that, right? Like they are really the first institution that a lot of young people come in contact with, right? And like the impact of that institution affects which institutions they flow into as they kind of progress through. So I just think that if there's no really strong plan without at some point in time interaction, engagement, and partnership with the schools.
Denise, this may be a time that you can talk a little bit about Huckleberry's Project Ready, which interfaces with young people in schools pre-arrest. Just tell us a little bit about what that program's done and how it's been successful.
Absolutely. Project Ready is an intensive case management and therapeutic home visits, individual and family counseling that happens for a particular group of young people that are in 2 middle schools in San Francisco, Martin Luther King Jr. and Willie Brown. And it's incredibly challenging when you have to deal with young people that, you know, come to school that are hungry, that haven't slept well, that have the issues that they bring with them to school from home and really do need that extra support. And Project Ready provides that. It listens to them. We have social emotional development groups, 8 weeks in each semester for the young people. We have field trips. We do a team building. We have an intensive summer program that allows the cohort in the 8th grade and the cohort in the 7th grade to get to know each other. And the end result is to help them to successfully matriculate into the 9th grade. And then we follow them through the 9th grade to make sure that they are successful and productive in the 9th grade. And the really unique thing about the program is that we go to the homes and we meet our families where they're at. And we do what we classify as home visits. And we sit down and we talk to the parents. And a lot of times the parents recognize things that teachers and administrators don't understand, and they've tried to communicate it, but for whatever reason, they haven't been able to communicate effectively to the administrators. And they're able to do that with the case manager and with the therapist and with the academic specialist, who adds a special component to the young people that need additional academic support. So it's an incredible program, and it has been incredibly successful. Our hope is that we will be able to expand services into other schools. But right now we are actually looking to increase our funding so that we can continue the services that we currently have.
So not that this just sounds like a commercial and plug. There are many programs that are out there, and many of our partners have programs out there that are really trying to solve this problem. And it takes all of us together. And one of the things we have all been talking about is how do we collaborate around this so that people aren't getting mucked up in the CBO system. So we do have a question about the community. What do you wish the community would do differently to support these reform efforts?
I just would like the community to be open-minded, right? That just to get away from that old mindset of bad kids and they need to be locked up and put away and throw away the key. Just to really embrace the notion that young people that make mistakes are a lot like the kids that are sitting next to you, or that are in the other room, or that are asleep, or taking a bath, or eating dinner. They just have some different challenges. And so just to be open-minded and just to embrace the fact that we're going through some serious systemic changes, and to be supportive of that.
I mean, I would say in that same vein, in addition to being supportive, I would say also to be hopeful, right? Because I think that folks are so frustrated. I'm looking at other questions that are asking different. There is, again, back to this idea that there are a lot of programs. San Francisco is so resource rich. Like, we've invested so much money in resources and programming and opportunities for folks. And sometimes it's not a good fit for someone. And they use that to blanket explain what all the programs are or how all of them work, just because that one didn't work for them. And they kind of lose hope and don't keep trying to find the right fit. And it becomes difficult because it works for someone who then says, put more money here. And then it works for someone else who says, don't fund that. And I think we've got to figure out what the balance is, right? Because, you know, and this is where equity gets hard for folks, because equity is not majority rules, right? Equity is not loudest voice gets their choice. And so part of this is like, how do we unpack? Because there's a lot that's happening, but the people that need to be participating, or the folks that we're trying to get to, maybe aren't participating, or it doesn't work for them. And so what does that shift look like so that we meet the needs of the people that would be more likely to be in that pipeline, right? That need that support, but who feel like they are invisible, who feel unheard or unsupported. And so they react to that. And so I think stay hopeful. Let's figure out how to get you plugged into the right folks, or for community really to tell us, right, why something's not working, and for us to figure out if there's something that's better suited, or if there's a tweak that we can make. But I think that balance of community voice, and community voice is not monolithic, right? And that we have to have, which is again, back to that earlier question about why so many programs, because not everybody has the same need. And I think that's the struggle in trying to figure out what we really need to be, where people need to be plugged in.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, a lot of people are talking about the work that's happening in LA and how successful LA has been in recent years. And a big part of that is the role and the voice of the community and young people. And they've had such a prominent role in those conversations. And to LA County's credit, they've listened, right? They listened. And so I think in these conversations for us in San Francisco, it really is about making space and making sure that the folks that should be participating, who are most impacted by these decisions, are, and know, like you said, Sheryl, where to turn and where to find information, how to participate in a way that they're heard. And it also means for us on the other side, that we're prepared to actually listen and to respond and to give them that space and that voice. I think they go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other. If you're going to have young people talk and no one's going to listen, it doesn't mean anything. And then also, I saw Lynn's comment about, sort of more investments in early childhood. And I think that that's a really critical piece to this. And, San Francisco invests so much money in the community programs for system involved youth, and it's so important. But as we really talk about reform and what that looks like, and how do we consider reinvestments, I think we really are sort of short-sighted if we're not really thinking about investments in early childhood and making sure that families have what they need, that young children, whether school age or younger, have what they need to thrive and grow, and resources in place. And so we're not just reaching people at a point of crisis or when they happen to get in trouble, but we're investing in families and communities from the start. And I think that goes hand in hand, and we have to have a really honest conversation about what that reinvestment truly looks like.
We haven't talked much about this, but how is law enforcement being included in the conversation?
They're at the table. They are at the table, and they are very much a part of this conversation, because law enforcement, they also are working on and need to change their way of thinking about how they engage young people, and making sure that they are developmentally appropriate in their communications to them, whether that's from reading the Miranda or getting information from them. So law enforcement is very much involved. In fact, we are looking at doing a pilot program with them right now that is dealing with pre-arrested young people, where they are actually going to divert these young people without giving them a J number or giving them a citation, and to be able to provide services for these young people to prevent them from going at all into the system, which is what we need. We need our young people to not, every time they make a mistake, have the fear of God that they're going to be locked up at juvenile hall. That was part of the problem when we had the SROs in the schools. The kids were being criminalized while they were being educated. And so we got to get away from that kind of a mindset. But law enforcement is very much at the table, bringing their suggestions, advice, and really being a part of the process.
So unfortunately, we're almost near the end of our time. This has been an incredible conversation. Yes. So what I'd like, just to kind of wrap up, if each of you have some kind of like closing statement, or here's the big takeaway I'd like you to have, or this is the most creative thing we have going forward. Just take a minute for each of you to kind of wrap up your thoughts about the conversation.
Well, maybe I'll get us started. I think just looking at some of the questions that were in the Q&A, and as we kind of close out, this question of, how do other people, other neighboring county, like, I cannot stress enough the importance of the power of the people, right? Like, I just cannot stress enough that the idea of staying hopeful, even in the face of disappointment and frustration, like this happened really because folks kept pushing, even when some folks pushed for decades. Some folks pushed, through a history of being incarcerated, right? Like that commitment, that dedication. It is not enough to just have the power that lies within the system or the institution to want to do this, because it can fail if they don't have the power of the people, the knowledge of the people, the heart, the love, the passion of the people, right? Like, I really believe that Young Women's Freedom Center and, BACR and Chalk and Huckleberry and like all the folks and, the Juvenile Justice Providers Association, like the passion and the commitment resonated. But I also think the lived experience of Supervisor Walton really ushered this in a way that could not have otherwise been done. And I think that the relentlessness that he had for it was really based on his experience, and that someone else may have been easier to like fall back because it wouldn't have been the same thing. So you really have to value, when people talk about subject matter experts, I'm always like, if you don't have a community person that's the subject matter expert, it's going to fall flat, because that is really what you need to move something forward. So as you try to do this work, find your allies and partners and people with the lived experience to move it forward and to keep you on track, to push back, to question and to challenge what you're doing, so you don't create something, it's not always if you build it, they will come, because sometimes if you build it and it's not what they want, they ain't coming. So, just that's what I want to say.
Thank you. Allison?
Yeah, I will just say that, like Sheryl said, earlier on, we finally have this sort of perfect storm of the will, the leadership, the commitment and expertise and support to truly transform the way this city supports its young people and their families. And despite, it is a messy process, it is confusing at times, it's frustrating sometimes, but if it were easy, we would have done it by now. And so I'm so optimistic about it, despite all of the sort of craziness. It is so exciting and thrilling to think about the possibility that we have in this city. So I am just grateful to be here and learning from you all and from these amazing women that are on this panel with me, and truly grateful for all the work. And like I said, it feels like this, we're not going to have this kind of moment again. So really excited, really happy to be watching and learning, and just can't wait to see how it turns out.
Denise?
I really have to thank Allison and Sheryl so much for agreeing to participate in this panel discussion. I had no idea how it's going to turn out, but I am just in awe of you two. And when I grow up, my twin self of my Gemini, one will be Allison and the other one will be Sheryl. So I'm pretty good to go. But and I also want to say that given the research that we have on adolescent behavior and brain development, and evidence about our intervention strategies that consistently reduce youthful misbehavior, the knowledge exists now for us to get this right. We have an opportunity to change a system that is really antiquated in the way things have been done for years. And I would just love for the community and for people to keep their minds open, to keep their hearts prepared to receive our young people back into their communities, and to ask questions, to get involved, to be a part of the process, because the more of us and the more voices that there are, the better off and the more complete this process will be for everyone.
Thank you, Denise. And with that, I want to thank our panel and the great questions from the participants. Thank you all for being here tonight. Again, a huge thank you for Allison Mcgee, the Executive Director of the Zellerbach Foundation. And a huge thank you to Sherilyn Evans Davis, the Executive Director of the San Francisco Human Rights Commission, and our own Denise Coleman, Director of Youth Justice here at Huckleberry Youth Programs. This conversation is going on and continuing. Get involved. Sheryl put some of the information in terms of where you can get connected. There's a lot of discussions going on. Have your voices heard. be a part of this. And I agree with what's been said here tonight. This is the opportunity. This is the time to really make a difference in the young people in our community. Thank you again, and have a wonderful evening. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Have a good night.
Thanks again for the invitation. Thank you.
Thanks for coming, Sheryl.
Thank you. Thank you.